growth. I hope we might be able to have a conversation about the challenges of accessing difficult stories at the end, but please do also put questions in the chat, or you know, if nothing's clear, perhaps you can signal to Isabella and she can interrupt my flow. I've got quite a lot to cover, but I'll do my best to get through everything. So first, if you don't mind, I'll indulge in a small autobiographical moment, because my stock in trade is, as you know, as a former journalist, interviewing people as a way of accessing stories. Here we've got Kirsty Young talking about what it was like to live in chronic pain on Women's Hour, an empathic interview. We've got Boris being held to account by Andrew Marr, a very key aspect of the interviewing process for a journalist in terms of speaking truth to power. And there is a real art to it. And I have accessed difficult stories via interviews, both as a journalist and as a researcher, interviewing refugees fleeing from conflict, and more recently working on COVID trauma projects and reality TV projects, where we've looked at the impact of appearing on reality TV shows on people's lives and resilience. So the aim is not to discredit the interview here at all, but to consider the affordances and the challenges of moving away from interviews. So this is why I want to look at the ways that we sort of worked within these participatory research projects, but the different techniques and methods we use. And I hope we're still thinking about all of this stuff, so I hope that it might just be that this offers some interesting ideas for you to think about too. This sense that the interview can be hierarchical, can cause anxiety and intimidation, particularly in young people, is founded in theory, and it has been noted that there can sometimes be a lack of inclusion as a result of interviewing as well. So we sort of took all of this into our work. So I want to talk to you about two different phases of the El Árbol del Amor project. Firstly, how we work with a group of young former child soldiers to make an animated film, and then how we brought those young people out of their indigenous community to Bogota to show the film to another group of former child soldiers who live in a refuge, a safe space. And I want to focus there on the methods we use, the ethical challenges we faced, and also the emerging model that we're working on to see whether the work we've done could be repeated in other contexts. And I'll finish by looking just briefly at some of the outcomes of the work to date. So first, I want to take you to Hambalo in the Cauca region. I'm going to take you to two places. This is the first of them. It's where we made the film with a group of children and young people. They're aged 9 to 24, and this region has been described as one of Colombia's spaces of death. It's home to the Nasa people, an indigenous community very much with their own way of living, their own indigenous guard, and they are living under constant threat. It's grappling very much with the reintegration of child soldiers and the stigma and stereotype that surrounds that reintegration. It's a semi-autonomous territory, as I say, but very closed off, difficult to access. And these communities have been really badly affected by the conflict. We went in under the aegis of an NGO, which was the only way that we could get in. They are very poor, very isolated spaces. They also have different belief systems. They believe that when a child is recruited into conflict, they are ripped literally from not only the earth, but also the family. And so they are stigmatized and often marginalized when they do try to return, both from their community and their family, more importantly, really. So often they can decide to go back into, for example, a non-state armed gang, a criminal gang, because it's safer for them to do so. It's a direct response to keep their family safe. And also it's a way of perhaps avoiding the stigma if they have been marginalized, a search for belonging, if you like, and these gangs can offer them that. So our project was based in these circumstances. We wanted to work also at a community level to try and encourage reintegration of the children, and so that there was some sense of healing within the community and a community narrative which is seen as the very beginning of peace building could perhaps be formed through this small contribution that we were perhaps making with the project. The second space I want to take you to is Ben Poster. This is a residential school and a community for children and teenagers in Bogota, in Colombia. Most of them are former child soldiers. and they were all considered at very high risk of being recruited by armed groups. So they've been removed from their communities. It's a safe space, it's also semi-autonomous, and the young students elect a mayor. They have chickens, they grow their own food, they run their own community, and they do daily tasks such as cooking, cleaning and gardening. It's an incredibly life-affirming, amazing space. And the former child soldiers, especially those under 18, often live separated from society to give them this security and a place where they can come to terms with their transition to civilian life. So this was an example of one of those spaces, and they receive education and support there. So we brought the former child soldiers from the Cauca region who made the film, which I'm going to talk to you about a little. We brought them out to Bogota to visit Ben Poster and to screen their film to the young people there. And they watched the film together, and then they sat in a circle and they responded to the characters and the aspects of the film, which really spoke to them. And they wrote a short note to a character of their choice about something that had struck them as they watched the film. So there are two stages of this. First, we've made a film through a process of listening to and sharing stories, which I want to talk about a little, the methods that we used. And then secondly, the collage of those experiences, which were created an animated film, were then responded to by the children at risk living at Ben Poster. And this was an intragenerational sharing, a workshop which seek to avoid top-down processes of peace building. And as I say, also to move away from ideas of interviewing, which wouldn't really have worked in this context, because as I'm coming on also to look at, there were ethical considerations around lack of trust. So we thought about this sort of immersive process where the children could listen to each other's stories and reflect on the impact of those. But the key thing here is that they had all experienced violence in some way. They had lived within violent imaginaries and they had shared that experience. And as I've said here on the slide, negative identities can arise from that. So the first creative technique we used was this poem, which I'll leave you to read as I speak, written by Jasmine. She's a 16-year-old former child soldier who lives at Ben Poster. She was 16 at the time we were doing this work a few years ago. And it sparked the creative process, which resulted in the production of El Árbol del Amor, the animated 30-minute long film, which you can see on Vimeo online. I can give you the link at the end. And the young participants in the Cauca community, so the indigenous young people making the film, wrote a response to this poem, which then became the basis of their script for the film, and they had not yet met Jasmine. So I'll just give you a little note as well on the participants. The majority of them were male, which reflects the dynamics of recruitment in Colombia. 79% of cases since the 2016 peace deal involve boys, and all but one of the participants became involved with an armed group between the ages of 12 and 15. So they're very young and they got involved. That again corresponds to the wider dynamic within Colombia. And with the exception of 3 participants, most had recently demobilized or become disassociated from armed groups. So they were still coming to terms with their experiences of conflict and the impact of the war on them. And we were doing this work in 2019, so just pre-pandemic. So I want to talk about the workshops to create the film. The participants in this were aged between 9 and 24. 5 of them were former child soldiers, aged 13 to 19. 10 were children aged 9 to 12 who'd grown up in the context of violence. And then there were 10 young people who were interested in media, you know, as like the young people that many of you teach, with a diploma in animation. They were all from the same community. Those young people were aged 16 to 24, so all young. We used 3 iterative workshops looking to build trust through narrative exercises. And the first of these, we asked them to comment on texts written by former child combatants, building on the poem idea that I've just shared with you. The second was based around collective memory, where they shared things that they had all experienced when we had managed to build certain levels of trust. And then in the third exercise, we used a human cartography exercise to map trauma to their body and their physical place within the world. So these all were within the narrative workshop, within the first workshop, three different exercises that we used, which meant that they started to trust each other a little more, and us. And it was my colleague Matt who was working with them on the ground doing this, along with a couple of colleagues from Colombia, including an animator who is Colombian. This then led them to write their own story and create storyboards, the older helping the younger. And meanwhile, the 5 former child soldiers worked on the story, and they were given Jasmine's poem and asked to write a reply, reflecting their own experiences of conflict. And we didn't tell them that we knew they'd been involved in armed groups. Their responses were only shared with us initially. There were lots of ethical considerations to think about here, and I'm going to talk about those in a moment. 25 individual stories were created, and they used these as a sort of collage and created 2 characters. What had happened to them was really personal, and there were often divisions and tensions and problems as they shared the stories, particularly when some of their peers found out that they had been child soldiers and they hadn't known that, for example. So we had to navigate these difficulties very carefully. Please note the set quote here at the top of the slide. These young people are naturally resilient. They live with war and violence, but they desire to live somewhere peaceful. So I think it was really interesting that we didn't see them as not resilient, as weak in any way, as victims, if you like. We avoided those narratives. The final 2 workshops were about creating the visuals and the final film and learning the techniques of basic animation. So the affordances of animation were that anonymity could be preserved, which is so crucial because many of these children were still under threat of re-recruitment, and there was certainly a physical presence as well on the edges of the school that we were working in at the time that they were working with Matt on the ground. And it was really important to them, though, that even though their experiences were being animated, that those watching the film, you and I, and the other young people that they were showing them to, believed that they were not fiction. They were not fiction. Everything in the film is real. And you can see the quotes here from Fowler, the animator working on the ground with them. So there would be a bus with colourful wheels so they might blend animation and real photography, real film. But the characters were all animated, as I say, so that they remained anonymous and present a collage of experiences. They don't tell anyone's story. So once this film had been created, the young people out of Cauca travelled for a week, and this is where I became involved in a week of dissemination where they took their film to Bogota, and we shared the film with the Truth Commission, which was a really important moment. And we did a series of workshops with former old soldiers and also with young people, as I've said, in the Ben Poster space. So 11 of the young filmmakers came with us, came out of Cauca to the Ben Poster Refuge and to see the young people living there, including Jasmine, who'd written the poem, and to show them their film. We did a 4-hour workshop there, which began with an ice-breaking exercise to put everyone at ease and to build trust. Then we screened the animated film, El Árbol del Amor, and that presents the stories of Sek and Arte, sun and moon, the girl and boy at the heart of the film. And then immediately after the screening, the participants were invited to close their eyes and envisage the character they related to most. Then we asked them to select important words to justify the selection of the character, and they were subsequently shared and discussed amongst the group as a whole. The aim of this was to forge initial connections between the participants' personal experiences, between the young people of Cauca and those of Ben Poster, and those represented in the film, and those of their peers. These experiences chimed very much with theirs. Then all of the research participants, so the young people from Cauca and Ben Poster, were put into pairs, ensuring each pair consisted of a participant from Ben Poster and Cauca, and each pair was tasked with writing a letter to one of the film's main characters. Again, they were free to select who they wrote to. Prior to writing the letter, the pair were asked to discuss and share their thoughts and reactions, and we thought that this process would encourage them to recall their own personal experiences. Each letter was then read aloud to the whole group, and the participants were given the opportunity to ask questions and offer feedback. And then we had further discussion, so there was an iterative aspect to this, and the sharing of their own experiences really started to build them. There's a lot of very rich conversation and very, very challenging things that they were sharing, of course, with us and with each other. As part of these collective discussions, we also asked questions at this point as the research team, and they shared their observations, and we also discussed with them their observations, providing an opportunity to sort of evaluate their initial reflections. And these exercises, we thought, placed the participants at the centre of the research process, in which they had complete freedom to creatively express their response to the film, whilst also sharing their own personal stories. So these texts, the letters that they wrote to the characters, were used as the basis for a group discussion then, in which the participants elaborated on key themes, providing more detail of their own stories and also interrogating and challenging their peers about theirs. And we thought about here that I'm just thinking about methods for a little here, sort of combining participatory action research with constructivist grounded theory in the work of Sharmaz. Each of these emphasised the agency of the research participants, seeing them as knowledge producers and co-creators. But we like this combination, this mixing of methods, and we selected from these methods to suit us because CGT focuses on the production of theory, and that bolsters what's often seen as a weakness in PAR. But we would argue, we're still working on this, so you may disagree with this, of course, that PAR's focus on transformation can strengthen the transformative potential of CGT. So we liked to think about the combination of these as we reflected and designed and reflected on the workshops. I was meanwhile also writing notes, making sort of ethnographic observations throughout the whole process. And we've, in the writing up of this, we've woven those quotes and those observations into our journal articles that we've subsequently produced. And creative writing, Sharmaz actually does say this, that creative writing is a constructivist tool to describe and analyse lived experiences and give them meaning. It sees it as something which can be a really useful process in terms of shining a light on and having a sort of bottom-up approach to the lived experiences, particularly of young people. So I talked about ethics. This was an area again where I worked on the ethics for the project. And obviously beyond getting this through institutional approval, there were many considerations for us. So this was our mantra: their voices, their stories, their animation. It was very much the work of the young people. Building trust, I've alluded to already, was challenging, and mutual understanding, both between the participants and us as a team, even though everyone on the ground was a Spanish speaker. There was a psychologist present as well, although that did not always mean that helped in terms of the ease of the discourse. Actually, we found in the end that they talked very freely to us as a research team. We were very aware that we needed to avoid further marginalisation of people who are already living on the margins. And we were really struck by the importance of listening and the value of listening to each other, and doing so actively, not just in order to take away what we needed from this project, which I think can sometimes be a trap that both journalists and researchers fall into. The lines between researcher and participant can, of course, become blurred in this sort of context, and we had to think about unrealistic expectations not developing on the part of the young people, and also for us not becoming too close. Boundaries were still important. And we needed to avoid inducing shame or embarrassment. Already many of them felt stigmatised by their own families and community. And also the aggrandisement of narratives, I think, can be a problem as well. And particularly within the Ben Poster space, where these young people are often, the discourse of peace and peace building is something that they might be quite familiar with. And we had to be careful that they weren't just telling us what they thought we wanted to hear. And that everything shared also was of equal value, because some people would have very extreme experiences of violence, others less so, but all of them equally valid. So there were loads of considerations and challenges for us. We were also aware that in watching the film and responding to it, this could take people back into traumatic memories, and it was clear that some members of the CALCA group were ex-combatants as well, so we had to be careful there about how they might be reacted to. And also we had to think about the impact on us, and my colleague Matt wrote a field journal because it had a massive impact on him. And actually, when both of us go into this space to do the writing up or work still on what we've done and what we've done since in this, you know, we're very affected by it, because we feel great responsibility to the young people that we work with and have also now left behind. I should say we did leave them with the laptops that we provided for them to produce the film. And some of the young people have now set up their own animation company, which is their films have won awards. So they are doing amazing work. So there is a small legacy there, maybe. Also, relying on memory can be very difficult, of course. People remember what they remember. The possibility of participant bias was quite an intense one. And also, as I've already talked about, that sort of social desirability bias, that idea of we're a research team and do they tell us what they think we want to know? And also, we decided that actually what the approach to ethics needed to be was dynamic and based in the field. And I know this is an area Isabella has worked in and has had speakers talking to you about within the forum for the EdD, actually. And I thought this was really interesting, and I've learnt a lot from listening to that. So thinking about on building how we build empathy and mutual understanding, and also ultimately the wider community, but through this dynamic field-based approach to ethics. This is just a little example here of what the text looked like from the Ben Poster workshop, which we then analysed thematically. So just a little bit here about story listening and storytelling, and how our ideas around story listening emerge. And some of you may have already heard me talking a little about this, but firstly, storytelling is intrinsic. If we go back to the Hambolo Khalkha region, it's intrinsic to the culture of the Nasa people. So we felt that we were definitely doing something with them, which was not taking them out of a comfort zone. But quite often you'll find that young people are not always listened to within the spaces when they sit around the fire, or the tulpa as it's called, and share stories. And this fire symbolises strength and fortitude, where elders bestow their wisdom. But the young people told us, and that their teacher verified this, that they are often feel that they're even more marginalised within this space because they have stories to tell, but as I say, nobody really listens. And so we thought that through observational and ethnographic processes, we sort of came to the idea that what we were really doing was what we like to call story listening. It's still something, as I say, that we're grappling with. The decision not to use interviews was part of that. The idea that we would be observing and that we would be immersed with the young people, and also that they were sharing their experiences on a level, both with each other and with us. And the ethical value of this is that mutual understanding sort of bubbles up and emerges as a result of this process. And we saw it as sort of listening to each other within the imposter space. When both groups were together, they were sharing stories, listening, hearing what was shared, most importantly, reflecting on it and writing back. So it's a dynamic and inclusive approach to peace building, potentially. So this is the model that we've started to build out of this dialogic forum of the Ben Poster workshops, the intergenerational workshops. Encouraging young people to organise the episodes of everyday life and gaining insights to their emotional lives, allowing them to make choices. So it has a very much an empowering aspect to it, but not in a top-down way that we are giving voice or going in and affording opportunity, but that the dialogue itself is the transformative experience, is something that both Matt and I care about very much, and it's something that we take now into all our work, and I value this very highly in my own work. An example of this process, if you like to call it that, is evident in catharsis, which involves emotional transformation. So as an example, the child soldier free from violence is able to imagine a peaceful life in civil society. You can see here how we've charted that the individual autobiographical. The community narrative attempts to arouse a collective catharsis. This is where the whole community is awakened to the experiences of those living in the midst of it. So through the mutual understanding that's engendered by story listening, they can move away from stigmatizing and othering the young people who have come from their midst but been ripped out in order to become child soldiers. So this potential for change and transformation is what interests us most of all. So I just want to use the last sort of section before we go into hopefully questions and a conversation about this, to talk to you a little bit about the outcomes and how we've gone through the process of analysis of the work using the methods that I've described to you. Firstly, during the group discussions in the intragenerational workshop at Ben Poster, it was evident some of the participants' experiences continued to be shaped by the violence of their traumatic past. This is perhaps not surprising. And it was through the act of sharing the lived experiences, including listening to each other and being heard by others with similar stories, that they could perceive and move closer to a more positive outlook. And here you have the character Arte in the film saying life was not fun, many people didn't care about us. This was the sort of mindset that they were going into the workshops with. She spoke for many of the experiences of the young people, previously unheard, as I've said. And the idea here that in achieving some sort of catharsis and mutual understanding, their own positive self-efficacy, self-esteem was enhanced, and they felt more hopeful about peace in the future. So in that way, as an individual autobiographical experience, they are mapping onto a peace building potential. And then just to look at that process of the intergenerational, you know, one of the participants said it was great to be able to voice our fears and thoughts. You know, we all know we live with conflict, but we're silent about it because silence keeps us safe. But, you know, what good is that doing us? And the shared experience, as I've already indicated, I think, is that, you know, for young people, all of whom had experienced violence, most of whom had been child soldiers, they realised they were not alone. They didn't need to feel shame or guilt. They were able to start a process of healing. And there was that growing sense of empathy, which watching the film, writing back to the characters of the film really manifested within the workshops. But also, if you haven't shared those experiences, as those of us in the room with them hadn't, and there will be others in their community who haven't, you can see different perspectives as a result of hearing these stories, and perhaps realise the impact within the community. They might realise the impact of their own actions, and, as I say, move away from stigmatising and othering. So onto that community narrative. In El Árbol del Amor, the community narrative invites the community to listen to the experiences, think about their own responsibilities, and invite the community really to hold up a mirror to itself. And I think this is something which can definitely map to other contexts away from the Colombian context. So, you know, thinking of feelings of sympathy, understanding, and remorse. And after this film was screened in the community, we did take it back in and show it to them. The perceptions of child soldiers changed from ideas of being evil and selfish to the idea that they were helpless or lost, and that they needed the help and support of the community. Arte here cites the idea of not being judged as being so important to them. And I've just written a few ideas here. One thing that Matt and I have been very struck by, as well as the sort of emotional life and the interior life as well, but how in terms of bond forming between young people, there can also be bond forming within communities. They're setting an example in a way through their work, through their creative artifacts to the wider community. And there can then be perhaps a transformation into a more peaceful space. And I think one of the spaces where we saw this in action and we were blown away, it was when we took it to the Truth Commission. They played their film, they spoke about their experiences, and the role of stories in peace building was so evident here, because this film was accepted as a testimony, the first audio-visual testimony that they had accepted. Usually a child soldier, former child soldier, would go into a room, sit down and talk to someone making notes. It's very much a narrative-based culture, and they would write down what they said, but here they accepted the film. And that was an incredible moment for the young people to be part of. They felt very, very proud of what they had done, even if very nervous going into, and actually slightly concerned about whether the Truth Commission really was. There was a lot of distrust around the Truth Commission in Colombia and the work that they were doing. So here we whilst we don't want to overstate the potential for peace building coming out of the story listening or these very small scale projects, we do tentatively posit that it is an inclusive approach which includes the community in the creation of their own stories through the production of artifacts, and that might be drawings, poems, ultimately those artifacts leading with the human cartography exercise leading to their own animation. And as I say, the acceptance of that by the Truth Commission sort of emboldened us as well, I guess, in terms of our thinking. So we're now working, and we're still working on this, to look at what these texts and exchanges might tell us about the self and the new imaginaries that the young people could envisage, imaginaries that take them away from a violent imaginary, and mapping this idea of post-traumatic growth and theories around post-traumatic growth to our work. So, sorry, mapping our work to the theories of, I should say, but using them to inform our work and then mapping them back. The work that has been done around what constitutes post-traumatic growth, i.e. that idea of bouncing back stronger from adversity, of not always living in a traumatized state. So we've identified 3 selves and 3 imaginaries, the first being the stronger self, who has bounced back from traumatic experience and been reconfigured as a result, manifested through the imaginary of empowerment. And this is where the individual can move forwards, they can feel in control of their future. And empowerment in this sense is linked to greater self-confidence and positive self-efficacy, and the realization of increased agency within this really challenging violent context that they live in. And within the context of post-traumatic growth, this empowerment demonstrates personal strength and an ability to appreciate life once more. And here, one of the letters written in the Ben Poster workshop is written to Dariel, who lost his life, was killed in combat. And we see this as an example of the stronger self, this idea of going forwards to fight and to move on as a homage to his lost friend. The next self we're working on is the idea of an altruistic self and an imaginary of community. And the altruistic self understands the consequences of their experience beyond their individual lives, so they're thinking of others. They link individual success to that of wider society. And this, we feel, shapes an imaginary of community founded on empathy and shared experience. And within the context of post-traumatic growth, this sort of altruism seeks improved relationships with others. So it, removes the young person perhaps from feeling isolated and marginalized, but they also feel they can share that sense of self-worth with others and mentor, if you like, and empower others. As this letter to Arte, one of the main characters in the film, shows. This is what one of the young people in Ben Poster believed Arte was projecting to them as a character. And then the final self is the political self and the imaginary of peace. And the political self prioritizes action as a solution. There's a very strong activist and advocacy element in this, makes a commitment to end conflict, forging the imaginary of peace, articulating a call for change, as you can see here in these excerpts of text to Arte and to Sek, the 2 main characters of the film. And this activism is linked to establishing new possibilities in life. And it manifested in this text as an ability to desist, which we see as the sort of the final stage. It didn't have to be linear, but this is perhaps the final stage that they might get to. So the letters that I've shared with you illustrate the emotional potential among former child soldiers to convert the negative into positive, I guess, put simply. And And I think and hope the exercise shows how the sharing of similar lived experiences and these acts of telling, listening, and most importantly, being heard are integral to building emotional strength, creating positive outlooks, and also ultimately contributing to an effective reintegration process for these former child soldiers. They can readjust to civilian life in a pro-social way. And one of the memos that I wrote as I was doing the sort of ethnographic note-taking in the Ben Poster workshops, I wrote that, and this is a quote, "There was evident catharsis and engagement in the process of writing. Many wrote at some length, resting on their knees." And there was that incredible energy around the way that they wrote. They just, it was pouring out of them. I was very struck by that. Briefly, we've thought a lot about space, and we will go on to write more about space and how sharing in a safe space frees the former child soldier from the burden of carrying their story alone, as they realise there are others with similar experiences, and also that thinking more about those emotional spaces. And one of the young female participants from the Ben Poster workshop, in the group discussion that we had towards the end, said, quotes, in sharing my story, it really helps to see other people in the same situation or worse. It helps you move on." So for us, that was an example of post-traumatic growth in action, if you like. So the power of sharing is augmented by this act of listening. By hearing other stories, we're emboldened and reassured. This, I think, is translatable to other contexts. We have to think of how we can do that. We need to get funding to try. But by hearing other stories similar to our own, we can feel less isolated or stigmatized. And the heart pumping here beneath the tree of love, in the film, it pumps actively as an animated heart, is the illustration of that hope for the future, that post-traumatic growth. And you can see here a little diagram of how PTG underpins the different stages and experiences of the young people, taking them ultimately to desist. So just to finish, alternative imaginaries emanate from the process of narrative reconstruction, and former child soldiers began to reevaluate their sense of self, and they shift their goals and priorities in an attempt to make meaning from the trauma that they've experienced as a result of these participatory workshops and artifacts, producing the artifacts. And alternative versions of the self are emergent and supported by this process of sharing, listening, and being listened to. So through reimagining the self, we think that the former child soldiers are projecting emotional growth, transforming the negative and into a positive, and looking towards an optimistic future. And you can see here the quotes that I've shared with you, which I believe show these. So for the former child soldiers who we were working with, their individual narrative reconstruction is clearly linked to peace building, and they gain a sense of strength and hope for the future. And one of the young Ben Poster women said, "Once you write your own story, it no longer belongs to you, it belongs to the country." So they felt that they were shedding the burden, but they were also doing something to contribute to the country being able to move on. Remember that, they were living in these spaces of death, and it is a country which is characterized by violence. So this is what hopefully they are working towards. And in the letter to Arte and Sek, and the friendship of the two main characters of the film, one of the letter writing pairs believed that their friendship showed everyone how the world could be and what we should all be able to aspire to. And it seems such a simple idea, and it's heartrending to read, but in that example, they felt there was hope. They could imagine an alternative world. And this is why we're so interested in this idea of story listening and the benefits and affordances of it in terms of catharsis, both individually and more widely. So next, I showed you the poster for Mi Camino at the beginning of my talk. This is our next, I'll just show you this a little, just to stop listening to me for a moment.
Dabeiba, Buena, orgullosa Bobarí, la comunidad Cuidabarí, cultivosida tierra de pena, Creabarí, Caragavide, Mabeda, Sirriosida, Mudai vida, Mudai tejidosida Cuidabarí, y Cani, Mu adelante seguibuma, Xiu, Pueblo Cacuara, Mujacabuma.
So the idea of Mi Camino, My Path, is that there are different routes that you can take through the post-conflict world, and this is designed by and with young people who live with violence, again, a different group, and it's an interactive story, so they can choose different routes through with different outcomes. And as I say, that's focused on young people at very high risk. Sorry, I'm moving on. And this is something that this is Matt's project, which he worked with Changing the Story on with HRC funding, which is young people working as journalists to promote peace building. So taking their own experiences of storytelling and story listening into a space where they are sharing their stories in a way which has an activist element to it as well. And they were working around Red Hand Day, which is the annual moment, really, day where we think about ending all recruitment of young people into violence and all child labour. And there is actually a UN target to end that by 2025, which is looming, and we're not anywhere near it. So these are my reflections and challenges, which I thought might provoke a conversation. Hopefully we've got 15 minutes, I think, to chat. But you may have your own questions. I haven't been looking at the chat, and I'll hand back to Issa to chair. But thank you very much for listening. I hope this has sort of made sense as I've shared it with you.
Thank you, Karen. That was really interesting and powerful. I'm waiting for question in the chat, or if you want, raise your hand or like unmute your mic. Rebecca Bond has one. Yes.
Hi, I've got loads of questions, but it's so interesting, absolutely fascinating, really inspiring. They're just kind of little questions, really, so maybe details. On the ethics, what did you do in advance about preparing for potentially sort of provoking a post-traumatic stress response?
Well, we shared, I mean, the things that I shared with you, we shared as considerations and mitigations. And we, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to guard against, of course. Not to guard against, but it's a very difficult thing to say that you will not engender this, obviously. So acknowledging that we were aware that this could be a response was an ethical, that was an ethical starting point. And then devising workshops and exercises which hopefully would mitigate or reduce the possibility of that. The attendance of the psychologist was an important aspect, that they had a third party to go to and it wasn't just the research team. And that obviously they could decide the usual things of saying, if this is too much for me, I don't want to take part anymore. They could withdraw at any stage. The usual, participant information, consent stuff that we do. And we did everything possible. The other thing, I guess, is that we all of the team were trained in trauma, which I think helps. Potentially are you thinking about getting through institutional ethics here, or in how we operated, I guess?
No, I'm thinking about, impact on the sort of young people on the ground. Yeah. So yeah, I think I'm sort of just putting my TV head on in terms of like how we would do it within television production, and just wondering how that kind of transferred to your process.
I mean, there is one thing that Matt would say if he was here, I think, is that, they have lived in a context of violence and trauma. and they have been born into that and they've lived in it. And that's not to say that you then think, oh well, you know, they can take this, they're more resilient. They are resilient, but they don't make assumptions around that, obviously, and they are young people, and we were incredibly aware of that. But I think the fact that we were all trained in that helped, because we could take that training in and you could spot the signs, and you have someone there who is also a professional if there were issues. And there were times where you would just stop an activity and, you know, play games or something if it was getting too heavy for everybody involved, actually. So there are sort of there are escape routes that you can have as well. I mean, just lots of different techniques, many of which I sort of shared there, really. But you can never, obviously it's a responsibility that you bear, but actually what we were finding was that it was totally the opposite of that. They were not traumatized by the experience. They were incredibly relieved to be able to tell their stories, and then, as I say, manifested post-traumatic growth, which of course is what you hope for as a result. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I think, you know, the trauma training is really interesting and really important, because obviously you went there as, you know, compassionate, informed individuals, but it's and you can't guard against having that, you know, if there is a kind of flashback response. But yeah, it sounds like you managed it. You went in kind of trained, but then also managed it in a very sort of organic, compassionate way on the ground.
Yeah, and I think, well, thank you, but I think that we thought about that, but also I think that's where perhaps the interviews, you know, they can be intimidating and anxiety inducing, and I think that's why we're very clear that we made a decision at the very beginning that we were not going to interview, because we would not, it wouldn't have, well, we wouldn't have got any of this work done in the same way, I don't think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Mike has a question. You said it impacts you and Matt now. In what ways does it affect you, Karen, since the project completion?
I think whenever I've been writing a paper with Matt recently over Zoom. He's in Colombia, I'm here, and we work together on a Google Doc and write together as if we're in the room. And we're both, whenever we see these letters, and the letters particularly, and remember the Ben Poster workshops, we're just very, oh, any of the words I use might sound trite, humbled by it, very, we're taken back into that space where we were pretty overwhelmed by the way that they were sharing so honestly and openly, really. And I think it just has an emotional impact on us. It's in a positive way as well, you know. But I think we really want to make sure that we're conveying things in a way that is a fair representation of what we experienced. And so I think we feel that responsibility as well. So it takes us a long time, and we have a time difference as well, obviously, many hours working quite late. It's a slow process as well, I would say, for all of those reasons, because we're sort of, yeah, it's powerful material, definitely.
Thank you. Nick has a question. I'm going to read it, but Nick, if you want to chip in, do it. What were you looking at when capturing the student voice? How did you provide mental health and safeguarding support around this project? You answered this a bit. Did you work with local partners?
Yes, we did. And actually, I was going to add that to my comment to Becca. We worked with a couple of NGOs, different NGOs on the ground who have worked in these communities before. They work very much around storytelling and writing and producing written artifacts. And so in the Ben Poster workshops, one of those people came in with us as well, and along with Matt, who has worked in Colombia in many different ways for a long time, and all Spanish speakers. So I think that was important. Yeah.
Thank you. Stephanie has a question. Stephanie.
Thanks, Isabella. Thanks, Karen. Fascinating. Really great to get this whole overview here. I have a question that is more a theoretical one. because I feel, you know, we've talked a lot where it is around participatory arts-based interventions, that we work in a very interdisciplinary field. And we can hear here the concerns that come more from a psychological approach, where it's about the individual well-being and safeguarding, and the individual, the personal transformation through trauma or not trauma and personal growth. And then at the same time, you're working in a group. So is this more like group therapy, or is there a social transformation happen? And then finally, providing voice and having this impact, accompanying the people on telling their story in the wider society becomes political. So it's even a larger scale. So yeah, it's a question of scale, but that also is a challenge to us and our disciplines, isn't it? Because you're working on a psychological level, you're working on a social scientific level, and perhaps also politically. And I just wonder how you negotiate that in your theoretizations. So it's obviously I'm asking because that's something I'm trying to unpack all the time, as we all are. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think the way that we're moving, we're just embarking on that, really, having worked through the story listening sort of concept. I think the two things there. One, the idea of the self and the empowerment imaginary. We like that because we see that as operating on those three levels that you've just described, and we can see how, and then we're putting it into the sort of context of taking from two different methodological approaches, I suppose, as I described as well. So that's work in progress, I would say, and also very small scale. Certainly we're not making big claims for the community or the political. I mean, a very, very small scale. I mean, it might be an individual operating as an activist. It's not like sort of movements or anything that are being generated by this. And then also the second question on my slide here exercises us, you know, if we're aiming to create change through these participatory arts projects, how is this measured, and how, so the impact as well, which is obviously something slightly different to what you're asking about theoretical framework, I think. Am I right about that? Have I at all answered your question?
Yeah, I think it's we're working through that, aren't we? It touches methodology, epistemology, interdisciplinarity, yeah, I'm gonna write to you separately as well for something we're trying to do, developing from last year's workshop on how to deal with these sensitive stories. But I just thought it was wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're just working on this idea of taking elements of constructivist grounded theory and participatory action research and blending those to get the strengths of both. And we're actually producing it for a peace psychology paper, which has been an incredible challenge because, you know, we're not from that background at all. So that's been very good for us to try and work through producing in that space rather than in perhaps a more, you know, narrative-based spaces where we have been producing journal articles in the past. So any conversations with you around that and with the work you were doing would be really helpful and interesting. So thank you.
Right. Next question is from Aaron. I'm interested in some of the barriers that might have been in place between you and the subjects, language, culture, situation, age. And I think you used a visual medium to also help these barriers. What was this through? Sorry, guys.
What was a visual medium? Let me see. I can look at the thing in the chat. Oh, there's the references. Yes. Well, the barriers, I think I may have described some of them. I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, everyone involved in the making of the film was a Spanish speaker, so there weren't language barriers. And in terms of the workshops that I've talked about today, the intergenerational workshops, it wasn't a problem for me because I was making my own notes on observations and then having translation where needed, and so that was okay. There were lots of barriers. There were physical barriers in terms of access at times, difficulty. Sometimes it was too violent to be able to get back in. There were getting the laptops in there were lots of challenges getting the laptops in, and our colleague Stephen was involved in facilitating all of that. That was difficult. When we brought the young people out from Cowca to Ben Poster, we had to get them back in the night because it was very dangerous for them to go back in the day. So there were all sorts of issues around responsibility and safety that we felt very much as a research team, physical as well as emotional. And yeah, I think as well, just the what was the other thing? Oh yeah, the visual prompt question. Yes, well, the poem, is that what you're talking about? I'm not really sure. That was, it ran off to.
I mean, there's kind of the short films you did as well. I mean, you talked about stories as well as kind of a way of learning a lot, because, well, I think my original question, though, I want to expand on that first, is, you know, I was learning Spanish in Spain for a while, and it's vastly different in Mexico, and I know South America has a lot of different variations of dialect.
Yeah.
So that's another barrier. Obviously, you probably have translators in Colombia. Does Matt speak?
Well, Matt's the one. He was sitting with me as I was note taking and translating and doing, and he's translated the texts, and so he's based in Colombia and speaks very fluently, and also the others, people that we were working with were all Colombian but spoke English, so they could it was no problem for me because I could speak to them all, and at the Truth Commission that was not a problem, and within any workshops, obviously the young people only spoke in their indigenous dialect as well, so there were, you know, but that was not a problem in terms of accessing things, but it is a consideration, definitely.
Yeah, it's
so
very
other points I would say were greater, some of which I've shared with you there, and we loads of creative different artifacts, and on the ground there was a lot of agility around that. If something wasn't working and people needed to have a break, or it just wasn't working, they try something else. So I think the other thing to take away, you can go in with a sort of research design, but it really had to be very flexible and you know, amended to the context as we went through.
Do you think there was a kind of collective trauma that you felt from just listening to these experiences? They sound so harrowing, some of them.
Yeah, I think there was. I think interestingly, what and I think hopefully this came out from the presentation, there was sort of the individual stories, and they realised they weren't alone as they shared them. And there might be, you know, there might have been a number of the women who had experienced really, you know, awful abuse, but they wouldn't have told anybody about that because it was so, they were so they felt such shame. And so being in a space where they could share those things openly, it was, you know, that was incredible for them. It can be difficult sometimes. And as a Western person going into that, you know, it might be that you think that's sort of a normal thing to do, but of course it's not at all within this context. And I think, you know, that was and in terms of collective trauma, and particularly within the communities, of course, and that's why they're often you know, responding in the way they are to the young people in their midst who have been combatant.
I think also creating their own media, like the films and stuff, I think that's really a part of the help with post-traumatic growth. I think sometimes, you know, as an outlet and getting their stories across in kind of more animated kind of fashion as well is a really effective means of helping their own mental health and helping post-traumatic growth, like you said before. Yeah,
and they really owned the film. You know, they were carrying in the posters, and they were so proud of it when they came to Bogota and did a whole week of screening it in lots of different contexts. You know, I think perhaps for them, this workshop was the most useful experience in terms of, for all the reasons I've said, but there were so many other things that they were doing which were powerful in terms of sharing their stories in different contexts. And that positive self-efficacy that comes from that definitely helps the bouncing back stronger, for sure.
I'm coming in because I've been informed by Isa that her Zoom is frozen, so she can't close the session. So although it gives me no pleasure to curtail such a great conversation, I'm also mindful that we're back at 12 and we all need a break from the screen. So I'll say what I'm sure Isa would have said, which is thanks so much, Karen. you know, it's an amazing project and a great presentation, and thanks everybody else as well for the really rich conversation. And we're back at 12 for the book launch. So see you then. Please stay in the call, camera off and mute, easier than if you leave, as I keep saying, because of the waiting room. But in whatever way you want to show appreciation to our keynote speaker, Karen, please do. And thanks everybody, and see you at 12.
Thank you. I'll look at the chat and respond to anyone I didn't answer well or didn't get to as well. Thanks ever so much, everyone. Thank you, Julian. Isabella.
Thank you.